correctly. So if you have the opportunity, text, email, let some other people know about this important discussion tonight. Many of you know, as Apostle Culbreth just stated, the Douglas Leadership Institute and the Frederick Douglass Foundation, our tagline is righteousness, justice, liberty, and virtue. And one of the areas that we have emphasized and highlighted is the area of criminal justice reform. There's a lot of discussion that has been had regarding criminal justice reform and mass incarceration over the last decade or so. And it's our hope tonight to be able to elevate that discussion, to bring you some good, sound information, as well as some practical understanding about this subject matter. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce the first of two of our guests. This is his first time on our program. I have known Dr. Anthony Bradley probably for about a decade, and I'm proud to say that I respect his scholarship as well as his commitment to the Lord and the work that he has done. Not only has he become just a colleague and a friend, but he is also a supporter of our organization, and we are grateful for that. I'm going to read a little bit from his bio, just because I don't want to cheat him out of the hard work that he has done over the years. I appreciate greatly those who are in the academy who have done great work and scholarship. We need more godly men and women, particularly African-American, in this space. And so allow me to read just briefly. Dr. Anthony Bradley is a professor of religious studies and the director of the Center of the Study of Human Flourishing at the King's College in New York. Dr. Bradley is also a research fellow at the Acton Institute and the Woodson Center. Dr. Bradley lectures at colleges, universities, business organizations, conferences, and churches throughout the United States and abroad. His writings on religious and cultural issues have been published in a variety of journals, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, Washington Examiner, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Detroit News, Christianity Today, and World Magazine. Dr. Bradley is called upon by members of the broadcast media for comment on current issues and has appeared on C-SPAN, NPR, CNN Headline News, Fox News, among others. He studies and writes on issues of race in America, mass incarceration and overcriminalization, youth and family and welfare, education and ethics. Tonight, he is going to be discussing one of his several books, which is entitled Ending Overcriminalization and Mass Incarceration. Dr. Bradley, welcome to our program this evening.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here and honored. And I'll say for the record, I think it's been longer than 10 years, which means we're a lot older, my brother, than we are sometimes willing to admit.
You would have to go there, would you?
Yeah. Once you get grown, those years just all kind of blur together. And what you thought was 10 years was probably more like 20.
Oh man,
actually, but I am absolutely delighted and honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, this is going to be a great conversation. I'm going to start like we do with many of our first-time guests who I know that you grew up in the ATL, but talk to us a little bit about what it was like growing up in Atlanta in your home, and perhaps how that influenced you to do what you're doing today.
Great question. So I was born in Atlanta. My parents moved us about 400 yards outside the Atlanta East Point city limit in Southwest Atlanta, also known as SWATs, for those of you who are from Atlanta. So I was raised in Southwest Atlanta. So I grew up at a church called Ben Hill United Methodist Church. And that was a church where everybody was, from Morehouse and Spelman and Clark and Morris Brown, Kappas, Qs, AKAs, Deltas, the whole crew. That was the community that I was raised in. It was a black middle class community. It was a community of activists, but also black professionals. I mean, the first Rolls Royce that I saw was at my church, and so that was sort of the community that I was raised in, we were the first Black family on our street in East Point, and my parents tell me within about 6 months, about half the houses went up for sale. And so my parents were part of that pioneering generation in the Atlanta area that moved out right after Jim Crow ended to do something new that a lot of Black families hadn't had opportunity to do in the Atlanta area, and they did it. I mean, so I had the privilege of growing up really surrounded by some of the most dynamic African Americans in the nation, folks who grew up with Dr. King and knew Dr. King. And we're progressive leaders in the Atlanta area. My dad's side is a bunch of preachers. My grandfather was a Baptist pastor in Atmore, Alabama. A bunch of uncles and cousins on my dad's side, all preachers. On my mom's side, they were all teachers. She grew up in Goldsboro, North Carolina.
Wow.
So when I graduated from Clemson, go Tigers, I enrolled in seminary and really began to sort of merge those two traditions, both the preacher side and the teacher side. So I'm currently a professor at the King's College, but I'm also an associate minister at Greater Zion Hill Baptist Church, right in the heart of Harlem on 127th Street, 2 blocks away from the Apollo Theater. And it was really the convergence, I think, of my mom's tradition and my dad's tradition and the community from which I was raised that had me to have a particular interest in making sure that the Black community was one that was receiving the appropriate amount of justice in accordance with the law. And that was really what sort of got me interested in so much of the work that I do right now.
Man, that is fantastic. There's a lot that I could draw from on that, and not that dissimilar, although different generations with Bishop Hunt, although he may not want me to let everybody know that he's from a little older generation, but that's a separate subject. So something that I want to highlight, because of it's part of my experience, it's part of Garland's experience and others that are on this call. Anthony, tell me a little bit about what happened to you at Clemson. As I remember or recall, you were involved in a campus ministry, and campus ministry changed my life for the better, largely because of people like Bishop Hunt. And there are many, thousands of young people that kind of came to the Lord, as well as shaped their worldview when they were involved in campus ministry. So give us a little bit about that, and then we'll go on to the book.
Yeah, so I arrived at Clemson, having been raised in the church, not really thinking deeply about anything theologically or spiritual. I knew songs, I could say the creeds. If you would ask me to recite the gospel, I probably could have made something up. I knew enough to say Jesus is the way, the truth, and the light. But it wasn't really something that was internalized into me in terms of my personal faith and practice, the way I lived and thought. And I had opportunities because I had two sets of friends that brought me to FCA, Fellowship of Christian Athletes. That was one thing. And then secondly, I had another group of friends that brought me to Reform University Fellowship. These are both college ministries at Clemson. And here's what people need to understand about the sort of age, particularly for males, 18 to 22. Two things. One, that's when a young man's brain actually turns on. Right, that frontal lobe kicks in. Mine kicked in my junior year. I remember it.
Wow.
And then secondly, in college, those college years, that's when you're asking big questions. Who am I? What is life about? What's the purpose of my future? Who is God? And the advantage that college ministry has is it actually provides a space for you to ask those big questions, and then have the scriptures provide the answers, because you have the time in college to sit around and ask those questions. So it's a really special opportunity to do that, and that's what happened in my case. I was a senior in college at the time when I got right with God. I'll just say it that way. A couple of things happened. One, I got dumped by the girl I thought I was going to marry. She turned out to be more interested in football players who had potential in the NFL than me, which is fine. Number two, I was planning to go to medical school, and that wasn't going to happen because my grades were too low because I partied way too much my first semester. That's a whole nother podcast session. We can talk about that later. Right. And then number three, I was actually experiencing some pretty intense depression at the time. And it was really the combination of those three things and getting turned down and rejected from an organization that I wanted to be on at Clemson that was an honor society. I said, all right, Jesus, this is me making a deal with God, right? I'm gonna hop in the back seat, right? And I will check this out. I will let you drive. But again, I was 20. And so the next thing I know, I'll hop in the back seat. Jesus took the wheels. And the next thing to know, the Holy Spirit dropped me in seminary in St. Louis. And that was the beginning of my journey, both into youth ministry and in theology, into teaching at a Christian college right now.
Man, lots that I could say, but that is a powerful story, and would love to make time to hear a little bit more of that. So you then go to seminary, then you make a transition to New York City. Somewhere along in there, you start writing books, and the subject of the one that we're talking about tonight, over criminalization and mass incarceration. What led you to have the desire to write this book?
So I was reading the work of Michelle Alexander, this book, The New Jim Crow, that I'm sure a lot of people are probably familiar with. And according to her narrative, that if you look at the history of the incarceration rates, particularly of African American males, she posited that this was because of the influence of a racialized way that the police were treating men and women of color, and that was creating, in her words, a new Jim Crow. That race was the cause of the escalation and the increase in incarceration rates. Now, because I'm a nerd and I do a lot of research, one of the things that we know in the social sciences is it's rarely the case that one variable is the cause of a complex state of affairs. And so that began to me raise some questions. Is it true that it was only race? It was only race that began to that sort of cause, if you will, the increase. And as I began to dig into the data, what I saw was that the narrative was a lot more complicated. There is a fantastic book by James Foreman Jr. called Locking Up Our Own, where he tells a story of how incarceration rates increased with Black folk in D.C. by Black folk in D.C. Black district attorneys, Black judges, Black police. It still went up. And so that complicated the narrative for me, and I just kept asking questions, what's really going on? And so when I began to focus on the data, what I began to see that this is particularly more complicated than race, that what we actually have been doing for the last several decades, if not centuries, is criminalizing poverty. And wherever you find poor folk, whether they be white underclass or Black folk, you will see over-policing and over-criminalization. And so if it's true that this country's narrative, and I can take this back into the 1650s, we as a nation, we have been over-criminalizing poor people from the beginning. Wow. It just so happened, because of changes in demographics, that focus in the 1970s and 80s and 90s was in inner cities. What we're seeing now, by the way, is that focus is shifted to rural America. So if you look at incarceration rates of whites right now, that spike's gone up in the last 10 years about 425%. You could think about it in terms of the opioid communities. That's where the focus right now is in terms of overcriminalization and overpolicing. The rates in the Black community have actually gone down, and they've been going down since 2008, 2009. But what we have in this country is a complete disgust and disdain for poor folk. And we have been using the criminal justice system to control poor people from the beginning. And once I began to dig into the data and see that it wasn't race, it was worse than race, that it complicated the narrative for me. Then I say, I've got to say something about it, and I have to say something about it in such a way that brings some different kinds of solutions based on that more complicated narrative, right? Because if it's true that it is a multivariate problem, that is, there are multiple variables that cause the increase, not just race, right? You've got race, class, education, geography, family breakdown, and on and on and on. Then the solutions also mean that we have a more multivariate opportunity to solve problems, because there are lots of places, particularly for churches, to enter into a solution by addressing some of those things, right? It's not one church can't do it all. Sure. But if multiple churches in a community do one part, somebody works on marriages, somebody works on education, somebody works on fatherhood. If we work that as a community, we can bring really, really massive change. So that was really what got me involved, is sort of digging in the data and not accepting the narrative that one cause, which was race, was the reason. That just didn't sit right with me.
Wow. This is fascinating, and thank you for being courageous enough. That's why I do like, one of the reasons I like scholars that are able to, take the time and to dig into the data, to ask the deeper questions, because sometimes there's more to it than what's on the surface, and a lot of times it's much more to it than what is popularly promoted. So I want to go back to kind of fundamental. I think many people, in our community, and certainly this audience, are more familiar with the idea of mass incarceration. I think fewer are clued into what it is that you mean when you talk about over criminalization. What is that? And maybe give us some examples of what that really is.
Yeah. So if you look at the federal criminal code, there are thousands and thousands of laws, thousands, like 4,000 something laws. And it's the fact. I can tell you right now that we all committed a crime today. That's just a fact. The criminal code is so extensive, and depending on what state you're in, I promise you, you could be arrested for something. You walked on the wrong side of the street, put a can in the wrong place. There's something that you actually could be arrested for. One of the things that's happened in this country is that we have swapped out, I would say, moral law for punitive law. And this is what I mean. We now define what is morally good or right or wrong according to whether or not it's legal. If it's legal, folk think, well, it's not bad.
Right.
Right. So that's a shift.
That's right.
So one of the things that's happened in this country is that we've keep adding laws, more and more and more laws, to try to control people. Now, here's what's fascinating in terms of the class dynamic. The folk making the laws are all middle class and upper class folk, right? Yeah. Who are they making these laws about? Not their children. Nope. The children of the people that live in the other community, because they want to control them and keep them away from their families and their communities. And so there has been this escalation of more and more crimes. More and more things are illegal, and we keep adding to the criminal code. We keep making things illegal, or I would say it this way: we open people up to being arrested for things that they would not have been arrested for years ago, or maybe it would have just been a misdemeanor. And we have an overly punitive orientation toward people who are socially deviant. That's the technical term in sociology. So if someone does something wrong, jail.
Right.
If someone does something bad, arrest them. And one of the most ridiculous cases of this that I saw was in Baltimore. A 14-year-old eighth grader. This makes me sick. A 14-year-old eighth grader stole some milk from the cafeteria, and because a resource officer was in his school, when he went to the office, because they caught him, he didn't get detention. That's what I would have got in the eighth grade. He didn't get suspended even. The parents didn't get called. They handcuffed him and arrested him, and they took this 14-year-old through the juvenile intake system. And anyone who knows the data knows that as soon as you take a juvenile and you process him through the intake system, you have criminalized him.
Mm-hmm.
It's traumatizing, right? And
Yeah.
so now you've opened him up to recidivism just by taking him through that process. And I'm thinking, why in the world are we sending a 14-year-old boy to jail in handcuffs in the back of a squad car because he stole some 87-cent milk? Now with inflation, probably $2, but you know what I'm saying. But for some milk, right? So we have unfortunately escalated the number of reasons that a police officer or district attorney can charge someone with an offense. And because state legislatures are the ones that write the rules, they often constrain judges' ability to make decisions. And so the judge has to rule according to law. And then we often end up with more people in jails than we would have seen 30, 40 years ago. So here's the way the narrative works. If we keep adding laws, more arrest. This is not how it works. It's not like more laws, less crime. It's more laws, but more district attorneys have reasons to charge people with crime. And that's how we get this over criminalization, because we are criminalizing everything. Because that's how we, in this country now, that's the only way we know how to introduce morality into people is to make things illegal, rather than using, I would say, another form of formation and restraint that we could have done, 100 years ago by talking about virtue and morality.
Man, that is great. I have numbers of thoughts, and that may mean that we are going to ultimately have to do a part 2 to this discussion, because there's so much to do, so much to be said, so many different levels of this. So I'm going to shift. Bishop Garland Hunt, I am going to do a little intro for Bishop. Some of you are aware of him, but I'm going to just read this. Garland Hunt is an Atlanta native and proven strategic leader with dynamic ministry background and extensive experience in leadership management and pastoral care. After completing a BA from Howard University in 1980 and a JD from Howard University Law School in 1983, he served as a judicial law clerk and staff attorney with the U.S. Fourth Circuit United States Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals is what I want to say. In 1993, he founded the Raleigh International Church, an influential ministry, the mission of reconciliation in Raleigh, North Carolina. As senior pastor, Bishop Hunt grew the church from the ground up. At the time of his departure in 2000, the church was thriving with well over 500 active members attending weekly. Hunt moved from Raleigh, North Carolina, back to his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. His executive leadership spans over 28 years, from the Fellowship of International Churches, Wellington Boone Ministries, New Generation Campus Ministries. He has served in many state and national leadership roles. In 2004, was appointed to the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole by Governor Sonny Perdue. and as the chairman of the board for the Pardons and Parole in 2006. 2010, Garland Hunt was the commissioner of the Georgia Department of Juvenile Justice, and in 2011 served as president of Prison Fellowship. I introduced to you guys my friend, I'll still call him mentor, and longtime leader within our organization, Bishop Garland Hunt. Bishop, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Bishop Dean. It's a pleasure.
So listen, why don't we go straight to it? You also grew up in Atlanta, Frederick Douglass High School. Shout out to all of our Frederick Douglass fans. Tell us a little bit about your growing up in ATL, and then we'll shift to this important discussion, Bishop.
Yeah, so my plight is quite different. I grew up in Atlanta, but I really grew up and became a Black activist. And I was seriously on that Black side. But the good news about that is that gave me a good view on the other side. I didn't grow up conservative. I grew up very, very nationalistic, what we would call progressive now, Black activists, Black nationalists, and I've flirted with organizations like Nation of Islam. We had people that came to Howard like Stokely Carmichael. They were talking about Maoism. They talking about scientific socialism. I was a political science major. So coming up in Atlanta, that just gave me a real heart for the Black community. And so my heart was so fixed on the Black community that it fit to everything in terms of my own perspective of race. I did it from the racial perspective. And it wasn't until later, much later, that I came to Christ that God began to deal with my heart, which required a heart change for me to even see the racial issues correctly from a race to a grace. And so I had opportunity to see that. I coming up from a Black high school, really Black elementary school, high school, a predominantly Black college, and a predominantly Black law school. So definitely that gave me that perspective. So my transformation had to be legitimately a transformation. I don't know about other people on here, particularly if you identify for the Black community. I mean, my focus was everything. So God had to actually transform me to have a attitude about race in the proper way. So it's been good hearing Dr. Bradley as he was talking, because so much was going through my head. And I love to jump in this because criminal justice is one of these areas where Blacks have been on the bottom half of this thing in terms of the percentages and number of things. I know I'm getting probably ahead of your questions, Bishop Dean, but let me just say this. So I do appreciate him bringing up that there are other variants and other issues that relate to it, particularly as it relates to poverty and whatever those things would be. But for the sake of my comments, if y'all can do it with me on this, I want to talk about it in the context of what it still ends up being for the Black community primarily. Because obviously the poverty situation still will adversely affect us in that regard. And so as I want to also, if I can, bring us to what we need to do to make some changes. So I'll stop right there and see where you want to direct us.
Sure.
I jump in.
Yeah, so let's go back to the same thought from Dr. Bradley, and I'll ask it this way. Most people probably on this call have heard, the work from Michelle Alexander, similar to Dr. Bradley, as he, dug into the numbers and said, hey, look, this narrative is not true. You also have, I'm just going to say, you try to be fair, but you also don't really fully agree with Michelle Alexander. Can you talk about your perspective on her work, why it was important, but why you also think that it's not the full story?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, without apology, I think that she opened a door that needed to be opened. And I do appreciate her work, and I definitely have right in front of me Dr. Bradley's work too. The door needs to be open because it does talk about mass incarceration. It does talk about these areas. But if you just leave it at the door of this is the way we're treated, like Jim Crow, this is just where we are, then it doesn't open us up for solutions. So I want to go on that particular part, because we could deal with the dynamics of what Mr. Alexander did with that. I'm grateful, actually. I know that makes it be hard, even though I disagree with some of the conspiratorial components of it. I don't believe there's a kind of master plan, but I believe that the enemy has a master plan. I certainly believe the Black community should be prospering and advancing. And again, for the sake of our community, for this call, I'm focusing on what can be done to bring a change to our nation as it relates to this. But we're vastly are not receiving what would normally be the situation where in our country, of course, we're supposed to be equal justice for everyone. There should be blind justice. And we know that it doesn't evolve that way. So this is the part that gets even kind of a little even stranger, because we do know that with things like critical race theory, all those things, it tends to put everybody as though they're bad and they're all racist. But I do want to unravel this a little bit and say that I believe that the Black community, I believe that the Black church, I believe that those that are standing for Christ have to begin to look and say, how can we responsibly address these issues? And then make a challenge for this. I'm looking right here at a scripture that is actually out of Isaiah 59. And of course, I've been in so many different movements and these things. We're looking for justice. Justice is a tremendous thing, as we talked about George Floyd, all these other areas. But it says justice is driven away. And this is Isaiah 59, 14 and 15. Justice is driven away and right cannot come near. Truth stumbles in a public square. Honesty finds no place. There is so little honesty that those who stop doing evil find themselves victim of crime. What's the point here? The point is that the Lord is looking back to us in terms of how we treat each other, biblical justice, how we resolve our issues, restorative justice, how we'll put ourselves in a position where we can change things. And so the book I wrote is called Crisis in America, a Christian Response. My goal is to try to bring us to a change, and it's going to have to be a change of heart, just like I received, but it's got to go all the way through the criminal justice system. To me, it's just like there is a problem in our nation. If we move far from God, it's also going to be a problem in our nation as far as the criminal justice system, because it's going to be fraught with what would be greed and envy, racism, all these other things, adversarial decisions based on the pure things that are punitive and not rehabilitative. All those things come up in here, and then costs come up in the thing. I'll use one example is being on the parole board, and this is something that I was able to see directly. We had to do a grid based upon what the crime was, and then we had to make a determination based on that grid and the facts of that person's case to determine how much time they would spend in prison. So we're trying to objectively look at this situation, but it still was the fact of the matter was true in some of our prisons that for Black and Hispanics up to sometimes 70%, but even generally percent, certainly over 40%, were usually Black or Hispanic in the prisons. So our attempt to try to fix that and come to some objective standard to try to help with parole became we had to have some other help biblically and spiritually. Now, of course, you're not supposed to mix the government, but guess what I did? I said, church, we need some help here, because we're going to have to do something to keep folk from going back into prison, because about almost 60 to 70% of those that came out of prison were going right back into prison without someone at the gate to help them. So let me start off from what it sounds like a negative statement to say the whole system is flawed. It should not be. It should be fair. It should be just, regardless of poverty level, regardless of race, regardless of any of that. But we do have a system that all the way from, if it's law enforcement, it's the DAs, if it's the judges, to the prison system, all the way through, that a person can go through that process. And because they are they may be impoverished or they may be Black, they still have a greater weight upon them. It's a shame that we would have to say something like this, that 1 out of 3 African Americans, it ain't amazing? 1 out of 3 African American males at some point may be incarcerated during their lifetime. There was a study that was done earlier. They're saying that these have gotten a little better, but during this time in the mid 2000s, we Blacks represented 13% of the population, but in the U.S., 1 in 31 adults were in jail, prison, or parole. But in the Black community, it was every 1 in 13. So my concern as a pastor is, how can I change that? How can I come after these young men? How can I change this situation? How can I cause people to be accountable, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's DAs? Because a lot of these young men who don't have attorneys to support them are dependent on these public defenders. And these guys are really close in here with the DAs and the judges. And what happens is, out of that, they're urged to get a plea, because they've cut down on court costs, whether they're innocent or not. And so unfortunately, what you have is they're pushed through the system because they don't have the support and the support, physical support. And in some cases, it could be racial, it could be poverty, whatever it may be, but it still means that they serve a greater penalty, because they're telling them this, you're going to go to jail for 10 years, but if you plead, you may go to jail for 2 years. But sir, I didn't do it, or I have something to say. Well, we don't care about truth. We're talking about cost here. So that plea deal and those kind of things have put Blacks in a particularly negative position, where many of them are pushed through in situations that were not necessarily the situation. And then as we talk about mass incarceration, or if we all talked about the whole idea of schools, children that are pushed into prison, that pipeline, and how real that pipeline is. Well, it's very real in the sense of, going all the way back to 40% of students that are expelled from school, 40% of students expelled from school each year are Black, even though it's 13% of the population. Well, you say got bad kids. Well, see, the family has to play a role. The church has to play a role. Men of God and women of God have to play a role to try to transform this, even in the schools. But I did notice one thing I want to include and mention, the positive thing I saw that in Dr. Bradley's book, is he was talking about in terms of how they begin to put the law enforcement in the schools. And so if you accelerate the law enforcement in schools, then a part of discipline is to get them in the system fast. And I saw that as Commissioner of Juvenile Justice directly. I mean, because they were pushed into the system, and once they got into the spiraling system of juvenile justice, it's worse than criminalization, because these guys, some of these kids will go from every juvie facility around the state. I mean, because they're dispersed in different places, and they were proud of it. Some of them literally were proud that I've been in every juvie facility in the state, and then they just graduate to the adult system. So from schools to prison to all these things, we have to look and see how the family can really make a difference. So excuse me for staying on a positive side about what the changes are, but there are tremendous stats that clearly say that we as Black folks, we got to do some change in our community based on the criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system without justice and righteousness, but two have to go together. If there's not a right standing in the heart of man, they're going to do what is natural to do. And so as a result of that, but righteousness and justice have to come together in order for there to be truly a standard of living in a justice system that we can believe in. Otherwise, the community must get involved, and accountability has to be there. And I'll stop for a second, because I know we're getting closer on. And
No,
this is a heartbeat of mine.
I want to ask a question, and then we want to see if maybe we can take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So we understand that there's, over criminalization. There is clearly mass incarceration, whether it is solely because of drug, the history of drugs in our community that's been dispelled. Talk to us a little bit about some of the positive things that you saw? And I'll say it this way. It's been repeated many times that when it comes to solutions within the criminal justice system, the better solutions are the ones that are rooted in a true faith tradition or a biblical way. Talk to us about your tenure at Prison Fellowship. One, is that true? And what was your experience as to why that would be true?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's pretty obvious. One of the things that took place, Chuck Colson, who of course most people know, he went to prison. He was the first one to go to prison based on Watergate. But when he left there, he said, "I'm going to do something to help those in prison." And so he established Prison Fellowship, which basically is this overarching, the largest Christian organization, actually ministry, that reaches out to those incarcerated. And then that our idea was to provide programs that can help them while they're in prison find Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. But one of the other things we did, which was not as celebrated, but it was still very vital, is that we also developed a legal component and a political component to try to advocate on behalf of policy that could affect the over-criminalization or mass incarceration issues. And so out of that, doing two or three different those in the White House at that time, but specifically, they begin to start really looking at criminal justice reform, which begin to say, how do we decriminalize or at least give people an opportunity that have been in prison for issues of nonviolence, or they've been in issues of drugs and things like how we can get them out of prison better and then help them to be restored back into the communities. So this was a bipartisan effort that I think has been tremendous. And I saw that while I was in Prison Fellowship, even after I left it, that fortunately you had Christian organizations that were part of working with the government to try to come against this over-criminalization issue. Because I don't know if y'all know this, but actually America has what is it? I have it in front of me here. Of all the those that in prison, America has such a high percentage of those that actually of the whole world that have been incarcerated because of what we've done. So we are an incarceration nation, and we have to come against that. We have to change that in order for there to be hope. Because remember, wherever the nation is suffering, the Black community gets it worse. So that's how I'm positive. Also, when I was at parole, we all started something else. I went to have a faith-based focus. I went to churches all around the state of Georgia, and we tried to find churches that would help us with those that were on parole and help them get back into the community safely. So they won't just get $25 in a bus ticket, because that's what Georgia would allow. $25 in a bus ticket. They were destined to go back to prison unless they had somebody to walk alongside them. So with the government, we went to reach out to churches to help us so that those that were coming out on parole would also have churches that could walk alongside of them in their transformation back. And so it will counteract that recidivism rate that we know about, which is about those are 60 to 7% go back within 3 years. I'll hold right there because I know our time is running short, and there may be some other questions.
No, this is great. So I'm going to allow, if there are those who have questions, to put them in the chat. That might be the quickest way to do that, and we'll take a little bit of time. So I'm thinking about kind of where we are. Particularly in the Black community, there's this now kind of overarching, sentiment that, they've spent so much time and energy locking us up that it has, as a result, had we'll just say a negative view of how we look at law enforcement. Notwithstanding, there's, a history that is there of how poor, as Dr. Bradley has emphasized, as well as minorities have been treated by law enforcement. However, to Dr. Bradley's point from that book, basically talking about Blacks also have been part of, law enforcement that has, impacted our community. All that being said, I'd like to ask to both you, Bishop, and to Dr. Bradley, where is the balance? Because when you have efforts that curtail, say, funding of law enforcement, particularly in urban communities, it has a unintended, perhaps, consequence where you don't maybe have the resources and the people, because they're always victims, right? I mean, and typically the victims in many of these cases are people that look like those who have victimized them. So my question really is, where is the balance, and how should we approach this sentiment that law enforcement is all bad and they're out to get us, when we should be concerned from a basic biblical principle that the role of government is to protect the innocent and to punish the poor? Dr. Bradley, I'll let you chime in first, and then Bishop comment afterwards.
I mean, it's really interesting that the abolish the police movement that emerged out of some of the George Floyd protests, that was kind of a white upper middle class project that some bougie Black folk got onto, because most Black folk in low income communities weren't about abolishing the police because they actually need the police. And so this narrative that I would say that the Black community is against the police, that's not true. The Black community is against injustice and bad policing. See, one of the differences when we look at the history of criminalization in Black communities is that we've seen upper class communities, they only want the police to punish and incarcerate, right? But historically in the Black communities, they want safety, but we've also wanted programs that deal with mental health, that deal with poverty, that deal with mothers, I mean, it wasn't just punish. It was punish and help. Because if we introduce more help, you swim upstream and then you don't need the police. The way to reduce the over-policing is to reduce the need for the police. And that's why these other institutions in communities are so important. Gotta have jobs, gotta have education, gotta have marriage, gotta have fathers. All these institutions are also important. This is why the church is vital, because the church provides the human capital for all of these other institutions to intervene upstream. Right? Now, of course, listen, in Black churches in the hood, you have police officers in the church. I grew up with police officers in the pew. The Atlanta police chief would be at church. There's a lot of Black churches have law enforcement Sunday, where you pray for the police, you pray for fire. So this, it's not like we're against law enforcement, but we are against injustice and abuse. And so we want police to be accountable. We want them to do their jobs, because a lot of us got cousins who were in law enforcement, right? So I mean that right there, I think is part of the difference. Is how do we have both law enforcement, but also how do we increase the level of resources and support that people are needing getting to make the police unnecessary. You want to run some police out of your community, strengthen marriage, education, jobs, fatherhood, family, children having, and this is, I'll end here because we're about out of time. The one thing that I end my book is talking about the importance of affection. One of the things that we know that undermines aggression and violence in teen boys is affection. There's data on this. And one of the things I tell audiences, if you really want to remove young people from the criminal justice system, they need to walk in your church and get a hug. Not a rebuke because their pants hanging down, right? Or they got extensions, or they got tons of tats. They need some affection, love, and care. And I think if there's one thing the church should be an expert at, it's loving folk. And that's one of the most powerful interventions in terms of reducing some of these rates.
Man, it's really, really good. Bishop, I'm going to give you the last word, and I'll ask the question, but you can answer however you want to. And I would like to ask both of you if you would consider coming back. This talk that we do every month is designed to be an entry point for most people. And so I want to encourage everyone to get both of your books on this area. This broadcast will be rebroadcast again on social media so that people can hear some of this information. But Bishop, before we turn it back over to Apostle Culberth for a few announcements and close it out, what would you say as an attorney, someone who's been involved in law enforcement, as a pastor, and as a father who has raised, two great sons, and a wonderful daughter, all of whom are married and loving Jesus. What would you encourage people that are listening? The one or two things that they can do just as ordinary citizens, or just as people that are in church, or just as fathers or mothers. What are some things that they can do to better our society, particularly in this effort of restorative justice and criminal justice reform?
Yeah, great question. Let me also say to the statement that Dr. Bradley first mentioned, which I thought was very good, that people are looking for justice. And that's true. Our expectation is that we would have a just system. And if there is any type of prejudicial policing, if there's any kind of prejudicial actions or DAs or judges, that's not our expectation. We would think that it would be fair. So, but where does fairness come from? And we think when we talk about the Lord wants to see us fair with each other. And the challenge is that he who comes back to the house of God, the Bible says judgment starts in the house of God. You can actually use that to say justice starts in the house of God. So as a pastor, I take personal responsibility for a lot of things that we just kind of let go by. We're not mentoring the young men. We're letting these teenagers, I have a lot of teenagers in my church, and I just make sure I personally try to talk to them, to support them, to encourage them, to hug them. I mean, just to let them know that pastor loves them, and then support these young girls in church. They may even have babies out of wedlock. Let them know that we as a church are supporting them, because it really starts at the family. If you break it all the way down, that's where it starts. Sometimes I see these videos, and I go, I'm much in the time, but you see these videos, and I'm fussing at if it's a black person, I'm saying back down, just respect the authority, because you don't know what may happen, because these guys are so anxious to respond. You just learn to respect authority. Well, that has to come from family, fatherhood. That needs to come from churches, the pastors that can help us understand what authority is and how to respect authority. Even if they are moving and overusing that authority, you still understand and respect it. But it's hard to respect authority if you don't even respect your father. And it's certainly hard if you don't respect your pastor. So there's a responsibility of the community to raise up these young men and women that understand differently and have some moral values that hopefully will keep them out of the law and out of the situation. So that will probably be where I would start off. And then, yes, I'd be certainly willing to come back, because when you start dealing with the communities and then go over the criminal justice system, everything needs an overhaul. Just like our nation, we need a move of God. And we need to very seriously pray for our young people that are coming in contact, because what they're taught in the street is that you react and you fight for your rights, and you deal with it, and you don't let anybody take advantage of you. And sometimes we just have to understand that may not be the best opportunity and may not result in the best situation. So anyway, but yes, I would love to come back. The thing I was just saying to you, I want to make sure you understand about how critical this is in the United States, that we represent about 5% of the world population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. So something needs to be done in our nation. And I think it needs to start with those of us here, that we can ask the right questions, and then we can put ourselves in a position that we can provide some answers or some solutions in our situations.
Amen. I want to say to all, well, first to our two guests, thank you so very much. This has been encouraging. It's been informative. We would encourage all to take a look at Bishop Hunt's book that can be found at crisisinamerica.us. You can also go to Dr. Bradley's his page and get or his website, and you can find all of his books as well as information. I want to say too, for those of you who are unaware, at the end of September in Atlanta, the Douglas Leadership Institute, along with the Frederick Douglass Foundation, will be hosting our regional conference. And I did put a link that is in the chat. You can go to our website. We will be hosting our regional conference, which a good segment of it will deal with justice and criminal justice reform, also in the areas of economic opportunity, educational choice, and strengthening the Black family. That conference will be in Atlanta, October 29th, 30th, and October the 1st. So we want to encourage all of you to make plans to be there. Encourage others. We'll have some special sessions that'll focus on Black pastors, sessions that'll be for African-American, really in all attorneys who are Christian, pro-life doctors will be joining us, but it is going to be a great gathering of committed leaders who are solutionists at heart. And so we want to encourage all of you to be a part of that. We're really excited about that. And part of that will be informed and sponsored by Georgia Power. Bishop Hunt is now serving as our senior fellow for criminal justice reform. There's some great work that you'll learn that they're doing in Georgia. There's already been a bill that's been passed, a very basic criminal justice reform step that will allow returning citizens to more easily have their driver's license. You know, you can't get a job if you don't have your driver's license. And so this is common sense criminal justice reform. These are the type of solutions that we're talking about. So thank all of you for the time. I know that we've gone a little bit over, but I want Pastor Arnold Culbreth to close us out as he always does. Apostle Culbreth, the floor is yours.
All right. Wow, what an impactful call. I'm happy to see that or to hear that we're going to do a follow-up to this. It's certainly too much to unpack in a 1 hour setting. But just to reiterate what Bishop Nelson just said, September 29th through October 1st will be our second annual regional conference. I just put that link in the chat again. So if you click on that, it'll open in a separate window. So when this call ends, you'll have that open for more information and registration. If you're logging on to this call with us and you're on your phone and you're not able to click on it, you can go to our website, dlinstitute.org, and that information will be there. Again, that's DL for Douglas Leadership, dlinstitute.org. But God bless you all. Stay encouraged, stay prayerful, as we know you will. And we look forward to connecting again with you, not only in our Leaders Live call next month, but in between. I'm sure I pray that you're being blessed by the various pieces of correspondence that we send out and newsletters and things of that nature. If you're not on our mailing list, please contact us at dlinstitute.org, and we would love to put you on that mailing list. Let me close this out with a word of prayer. Father, thank you. Thank you for all of this information, oh God, and inspiration, and in many instances, revelation. God, we thank you that these are not ethereal or pie in the sky kinds of conversations, Father, but practical grassroots resources, oh God, much of which is derived directly from your word. So, Father, we ask that you continue to strengthen us. continue to embolden us, and continue to anoint us to do the work that you've called us to do. And God, we will do it, and we will be so careful to give you the thanks and the praise in the mighty name of Jesus.